Welcome to the Global Discussion, a discussion with creatives, leaders, and thinkers. My name is Simon Hodgkins, and today I'm really delighted to be joined by David Carson. David, you're very welcome to the show. I'm going to begin, though, by asking you maybe give a little bit of an intro into the world of David Carson. What have you been up to in your career, and what's keeping you busy today? So you're very welcome, David.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks, Simon. Appreciate it. So I'll do like the quick recap because I've had a long career. I won't go way back when, but most of my career has been spent in advertising and marketing and in creating entertainment for the most part. And I started an early company like Internet 1.0, a company called Heavy.com, and it was primarily us making a bunch of really weird content that somehow found an audience and we ended up having like 30 million people that came to the site every month, which back then was actually quite large. This is all very pre-YouTube. But that was sort of this beginning, this journey of working with clients as well who would come to this network that we had. So I ended up working with American Express, with Nike, with Coca-Cola, with American Eagle Outfitters, with just a range of different clients over the years. And what became sort of my style, I guess, if you will, was sort of this idea that dumb ideas are the things that work in markets. Like dumb ideas seem to be the things that people most gravitate to. It's the thing that usually grabs the most attention. And I didn't really realize that that's what I was doing at the time. I thought what I was doing was quite smart, but it turned out that it was actually quite dumb, and that was kind of the secret sauce. So that has sort of led me through this career of creating these companies based around dumb ideas.
Well, I love that. And look, we've got to talk about Dumbify. And, there's a few things that I read with interest, which is about finding genius where other people see nonsense, right? I think that's
Totally.
that's very good. And obviously getting smarter by thinking dumber. How does that work, David? Tell us a bit
Yeah,
about this.
it sounds very counterintuitive, I know. And, it's not to say that dumb thinking isn't, it's not about a low intelligence. It's not about, somehow not being logical. It's just that you're really trying to go beyond where logic kind of ends, essentially. So a framework around that is there's all this territory in your brain that you're just not comfortable using, mostly because your parents wanted you to be smart, your teachers wanted you to be smart. Like there's a reward system for being smart, and it kind of gets you in this mode of thinking. And there are these other, parts of your brain that just really come up with these wild, weird scenarios, right? Places where you're bored, you tend to come up with some of these, or moments where you might be meditating and trying to be mindful, and like these weird ideas, right, will pop up. But we've never really had a reward system to entertain those ideas, right? With the exception of when you go into entertainment or possibly into marketing and advertising. But I've always found that people tend to throw away their dumb ideas rather than lean into them because it makes them uncomfortable. It makes them feel like they might look stupid, right? Essentially. And so what Dumbify is really is a framework to show you that those dumb ideas are actually can be quite valuable. And if you just lean into them, if you kind of conquer that fear, get over the fear of feeling like you might look stupid, and then just sort of spend more time with your dumb ideas and really kind of stretch them and see if they can actually solve problems. And when you look at history, honestly, and you see all of the things that we've benefited from as a culture, whether it's from science, whether it's from the arts, right? You will find that most big ideas were seen as being really dumb at the time. And I don't know, for me, that gives me great confidence that if I have a dumb idea, I'm maybe not in bad company. Doesn't mean it's a good idea, right? But at least, I've got to give that one a shot. It's equally as valid as any smart idea I might have.
I love that. And I know when you're talking about, and we'll get on to the book. I'm not sure where that's at in terms of its progress, but you mentioned things like the history when you look back and you talk about things like gene editing or renting a stranger sofa, something that you would have thought was a little bit far-fetched or a little bit, I think you call it half-baked ideas at first,
Hmm.
but then you're sort of pulling that curtain back onto you, sort of saying, well, hang on, there's a few moments here, there's some learning here, that some of those big breakthroughs, some of those billion-dollar companies, some of those great ideas, they actually came through something that when you first looked at it, you went, that doesn't sound right. That's a bit dumb. Uh,
Yeah, that's right. A lot of ideas that came from people entertaining those dumb ideas that kind of come into their head. I mean, they're all pretty historic. Like go way back with like Archimedes, and Archimedes is known as being this really brilliant, right, mathematician, but how he actually discovered how to do this very specific problem where the king wanted to know if this gold crown that he had was actually made of pure gold, right? And you couldn't melt it down and see what was inside, like you had to keep it intact. But it took, like, Archimedes was sitting in his bathtub, got in his bathtub, and he just noticed how the water would rise when he would get in. And it was just kind of a dumb thought that kind of got in through his head. But he got so excited because it's just like triggered this part of the brain where he realized how he was going to solve that problem. And like the word eureka comes from that moment. He jumps out of the tub and famously, runs into the town screaming Eureka, right? Which means I've got it, right? Essentially. But like even things like think about today, if you were going to go to the hospital and you were going to get surgery, you would probably want that surgeon to have very clean hands, right? But yet go back like 250 years ago, people thought that was a really strange, dumb idea. You would go directly from inside somebody's chest cavity to delivering a baby without washing your hands. And the guy that came up with this idea, right, just really noticed that the nurses kept washing their hands, but nobody else did. And right, he started noticing that there was, a lot of death happening around the ones where people weren't washing hands and the others. And he had this crazy idea that there might be like these tiny microscopic, right, things that are on our body that we now call bacteria. And people thought he was nuts. They literally put him in an insane asylum for washing your hands, right? So again, just like sometimes ideas that we just take for granted were seen as being really dumb ideas. But fast forward to, the last 10 years, you've got so many businesses that have been started off of dumb ideas that are large billion-dollar businesses. And certainly the ones that come to mind are, things like Airbnb, right? Obviously, we take that for granted now, but if you go back in time and remember when that company first came out, like the Genesis, when it was just like those three dudes and they were just thinking about how could we make some money? Could we actually get people to come to our apartment? Could we get them to sleep on the floor on an air mattress, right? Would people actually book a service to stay there? And they even thought, well, we'll actually give them breakfast as well. They actually made like a box and their own like little cereal for it. It was really silly. But that was the genesis of Airbnb. And what always makes me laugh the most is think about all those times that you've had conversations with friends, and you're drinking maybe at the pub and you're just having a laugh, and all of a sudden a really dumb idea comes out, and you all kind of laugh, but you move on, right? But the Airbnb guys, they're like, that's really funny. They took agency and they're like, well, wait, like let's try it, right? Why not? So there's always that leap, right? So like Dumbify is kind of that framework. How do you go from this silly idea to then recognizing that, well, let's just not throw it away. Let's lean into it and let's try and make something, right? Make something out of it. I think about things like Liquid Death, which is right the water brand. And again, like if you're gonna have a new beverage, well, sure, let's do water, right? Doesn't get any more potentially boring than that. But even the way that water is marketed, it's very fresh, it's very clean. It comes from a mountain or somewhere far away that's pure, but to this company, they're like, no, we're going to package it as if we're a Norwegian death metal band and we're going to call it Liquid Death. Like how silly. And again, that could have been a pub conversation, but instead it turned into, right, taking agency and actually building it, right, and making it happen. So my goal really is to at least get those people who might have those dumb ideas and maybe feel afraid or feel like they just don't know how to take agency with those to help them take agency. And then the other is for people who might just feel ashamed for even, mentioning those ideas out loud because they feel like they might get fired, right? How can I help them? How can I help give them confidence, right? Essentially to start thinking or at least, acknowledging that those thoughts are valid.
Yeah, and they're great examples that you're giving here because those companies are huge. I
Oh,
mean, what a
massive.
success from something that when you first think about it, you go, "That's never going to work. That's a little bit strange."
And that's
But do you
most things. Most things that are successful usually start off that way.
right,
That's strange. I don't think that's going to work.
right? And I wanted to ask you a little bit because you've talked a bit about sort of giving people the confidence there, and the culture today seems to be that you have to look a certain way, you have to speak a certain way, you have to appear clever and smart, and you have to share all this information. But you're actually going a slightly different. You're saying, look, it's okay to maybe choose a different way. It's okay to think about some of those sort of outside thoughts a little bit, to think a little bit different, maybe to sound a little bit foolish, right? Do you think that's part of the culture today that we're almost afraid to do that
Yeah,
more
I
these
think
days?
so. I think there's something weird that happens when people start thinking about optimization, right? And data. And while all that's wonderful, don't get me wrong, like, being able to see data and see if something is working is amazing, wonderful. However, if that's your real mode of thinking, right, that you really can't think outside of that, very narrow window, I think that's kind of a tragedy for everybody because what you get then are very standard ideas, very mediocre ideas. You get things that don't necessarily move or change culture. You don't get things that are actually like a step change, right? You get things that are kind of optimized, like it's new things around the edges, right? Essentially. And it feels like you can really get yourself into a trap. That's one. So I've almost come to think that being clever is actually the enemy. Like there's something that happens with cleverness where you feel like you have to be smart, right? And being smart, I mean, to me, it just always seems very performative, right? It's like people are like, they're in a meeting and they're trying to say the smart thing. And there's probably a great idea that's in that room that's actually going to either solve the problem or create the change that's needed. But this performative nature in our culture to always look and sound smart is just too prevalent. So how do you get people to really embrace being a fool? How do you get them to embrace sounding dumb, right, in a room? And it takes a special kind of person to do it naturally. I think it also takes a very special kind of leadership of a group, right, that can sort of allow that to happen and to see real things come from it. But you see, I go back to people like Richard Feynman. Are you familiar with Richard Feynman, right? I mean, as a scientist, and certainly as, the guy who's like the father of quantum computing now, how he thought was just so silly. This is a guy who won a Nobel Prize, and he wasn't afraid to go into a bar and just play some bongos and just recite weird poetry with his students, right? And with his coworkers. Like he got silly quite a lot. But his nature of being silly were the things that allowed him to make these strange lateral connections, right, in his thoughts. So I if there was anything that people could bring with them is, you know, who are the people that I want to emulate most of my life that I feel like made really big changes? Richard Feynman, right, would certainly be one of those. Or you could look to talking about if you're in business and you want to create the next Airbnb, those are really silly ideas. Like you almost have to look at, smart ideas as potentially being where ideas go to die, or right, you're just really optimizing things. So it's almost how do you flip your thought process that says, oh, every time I try and act smart, right, every time I just trying to optimize, I'm not really going to be that successful at solving this problem, not in a really right interesting way.
I gotta ask, as you're talking there, um, I'm going to raise the AI question here, right? Because we're in this frenzy of AI still. It keeps getting better and better. But AI, as we know, these large language models, they scrape a lot of data. They collect the world's data in inverted commas. And they try to make sense of that and output something that's useful. And some of it's getting really, really good. But how does that sit with you, David, in this sort of world of actually sometimes it's the ideas that aren't going to come out in that manner, that aren't the best ideas. It's not about just cataloging and regurgitating information. It's about thinking differently. Or is AI a great tool? How do you view it at the moment from your position?
From my position, I actually do see it as a great tool, if I'm honest, because the way that I think a lot of dumb ideas come about, though good ones, is really about synthesis. And AI is a really interesting synthesis engine if you let it, right? Like think early on when all we knew about AI was how many mistakes it was making, right? There was something interesting about those mistakes that it's almost as if it was making wrong connections on purpose, right? It obviously wasn't trying to give you a wrong answer, but it was kind of interesting. I think of things like this might sound a little obtuse, but like the Beatles were trying to copy right Black American musicians, right, blues musicians, and they were terrible at it. But they ended up sounding like the Beatles, right? This is like because of their inept copying, right? They were able to sound like themselves, right? Ditto like Rolling Stones, right? Anybody that's actually started off has actually used right something that they're trying to emulate, right, in some way. And AI is kind of an interesting it's if I think about that idea and think that AI is really trying to copy, right, culture, it's trying to copy everything that it can get its hands on, and yet the way that it wants to feed it back to you can sometimes be flawed, and those flaws are actually quite interesting. But over time, it's gotten much better, right? Like those little flaws started to go away. I've actually started to create my own little custom GPTs primarily to try and generate dumb ideas, right? Essentially. And I made this little engine for myself that actually works really well. There was a guy that turned me on as this came from a very dumb idea. I'm on TikTok, and this kid asked the question. He says, "If large is the opposite of small, then what is the opposite of medium?" Right, was his question. And I thought that is a really fun question, right? There are just so many different ways, right, to answer that. But what I where my brain ended up taking me to that was actually in building this custom GPT. Because for me, medium, there's sort of like this weird thing when you think about medium where it feels like it's maybe a compromise, right? And so to me, like maybe the opposite of compromise was uncompromising potentially, right? And I thought, oh, that's pretty interesting. So like, but if you were to think about when you were in school, do you remember those Venn diagrams? Right? It's just like maybe for us it'd be like fifth grade, right? And you put those two circles together, and they'd want you to put those two circles together, and that thing in the middle was usually that overlap, that thing that they share, right? Essentially. But if you were to take that same idea, but you're not really looking for commonalities, you're really almost taking it like a hadron collider, where you're taking two opposite things, right? Two opposite elements, and when you crash them together, this thing in the middle, right, becomes something entirely new. And so that's what I had built the engine to do, is to take two complete opposite thoughts, smash them together, and then give me the thing in the middle, right? Essentially that gets created right from it. And so it would do silly things like it said, okay, I'm going to take cooperation and competition and I'm going to smash them together. And it came out with co-opetition as this idea. I thought that's a really funny, interesting idea. And then my mind immediately went to, well, yeah, I mean, we kind of have that already. When I think about collabs that we all sort of know and love today, like maybe they're getting a little too out of hand, but think about like Crocs, low end, right, and Balenciaga, very high end, and they smash together and they make that ridiculous, but right, everybody's talking about this Balenciaga Croc shoe, right? So those types of things, I think AI can be your friend, can be your tool, right? I think you can have very silly conversations with it, right, as well. So where that goes in the future, I've no idea, but I think it can be utilized to help get your mind. If you're not used to thinking in a very dumb way, with the right instructions, I think it can probably help you get there.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. And I want to ask you something about, I suppose, the blue chips, the corporate, the big global brands, because look, you're well known as an entrepreneur, you're a marketing innovator, and you've worked with some big brands, whether it's Nike or Coca-Cola or IKEA or American Express, right? You've worked in that with very, very high-end creative thinking, and some of the companies that you have and some of the roles that you've done, you've impacted millions of people worldwide. But I want to ask you whether it's from that time, or whether it's, cutting edge agencies at the time like Ogilvy and others that you've been involved with. So how does this sit within that sort of corporate brand, that global organization? Because sometimes they have a very set way. They might be around for 30 years at this stage or 100 years in some cases, and they have a very set way of doing things. And you're bringing this sort of creative thinking, this new way of thinking, almost this reason to just, maybe come up with something a little bit different this time. Is that an easy conversation when you're working with global giants, or is that really difficult?
I think it depends on, what the client is trying to do. What are they trying to achieve? Oftentimes you've got really large clients that are looking to figure out a new strategy, right, for their company because the world has changed in the way that they need to, either react to it or lead their way through it, right, needs to change. And that's actually where dumb ideas and dumb thinking can actually be quite good. But it can also come down to levels of very tactical levels where, maybe what they need to do is create a whole new program or service, right? And so by utilizing dumb thinking, you can come up with new things that they might not have thought of. Like a good example, I was having a friend, we were having drinks, and she was talking about what they were doing with American Express a few years back, and they actually ended up getting some really interesting services, new services for American Express just based off of jokes that they were throwing around the room. And so one was they were trying to figure out a program around people who liked sports, right, that were using the card essentially, right, American Express to go to like, football games, right, go to US Open and so forth. And one of the things that somebody threw out as a joke in the room was, you know what I really hate? I really hate when I buy a jersey of my like favorite NBA star, let's say, right? And not but like a month goes by and they get traded right to another team. So now that thing is just like I wish I could get a refund, right? Everybody kind of laughs right in the room. But kudos to American Express because that dumb thing that was just said in the room, they're like, wait, that's actually genius. Of course, right? That seems like a very over the top thing, right? That a company ought to do. Like, hey, when your favorite star gets traded and you've just bought their jersey, of course, right, you're gonna get your money back. That's only a return that American Express, right, would make. Now that's a very small level, very tactical, right, kind of thing, but I think it's pretty applicable just to think that in that room, they were all kind of laughing and joking with each other. And that's just the kind of space where everybody starts thinking a little more freely. They start thinking a little more, there are these interesting lateral jumps that you can start to make. Right. If everybody would have thought about being really clever and like, let's get to work and, like you just don't get ideas that really, right, kind of flow. When you see a bad performance of an actor, it tends to be because they're overthinking, right? When you have a bad performance of somebody who is in the creative field, it's usually because they're overthinking. And so I think whether you're a large brand or a small brand, I think you always want people who aren't just going to overthink everything. You're trying to cut through for clarity. You're trying to find conciseness. You're trying to find simple, right? And you're trying to find ways that can sort of activate your brand in ways that people will remember, right? That people will. So I find that most of those dumb ideas in the room are welcome, unless you're at a place, right, where the client, just will not allow it. We've all had plenty of those, and I tend not to work with those folks, thankfully, and I know where I'm not welcome, right, for the most part. But I have found that the vast majority of them actually appreciate it once they see the results.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And look, it's a fascinating topic, but I don't want to run out of time here. I want to just squeeze a few more in before we wrap up. So, the next sort of 6 to 12 months, what's on your roadmap? What's on your horizon? What's keeping you busy?
What's keeping me busy right now are a few things. So on the Dumbify side, there's the newsletter that I put out every week, and that's honestly just something I really love doing, pulling together for people to understand, some frameworks that might be helpful for them. Which, by the way, you could find at david-carson.com to sign up for that. And then I'm finishing up the book, which hopefully should be out this summer in August for Dumbify. And there's another project that I've taken on this summer because it just fits so well with Demify in general. And it's around these minor league baseball teams here in the United States. And what I love about minor league baseball is it's just always fun, like it's meant to be fun. And you've got these kids that are obviously trying to get to the pros, but that's not really what the fans are really there for. They're there, right, to have a really good time. And they were like these wonderful, kind of moments that you can create in live environments that I'm really kind of looking forward to. And it's just nothing but dumb ideas, right? Essentially. So I'm really having a lot of fun with that. That I figured I couldn't go wrong with dumb ideas and baseball for the summer.
That sounds good. That sounds like a plan. Um, Look, finally, I'm going to ask you in a moment to maybe give us some takeaway thoughts or just something you want to leave us with to think about, some last thoughts from you. You mentioned the newsletter, and I just want to cover that again. People can go to david-carson.com. That's really important. Go and check out the newsletter. David would love you to sign up for that. There's some great insights coming from that. And obviously, keep a lookout for the book. It's going to be a really good one. But, David, any sort of final thoughts you want to leave with us before we wrap up today?
I think maybe a final thought might be where this came from for me was when a friend of mine mentioned over dinner that we were in this headspace that we were almost kind of depressed in a way. We had built our companies to a certain stage and we thought, is this it? Like, can we actually grow this further? Can we make this bigger? Can we make this better? And we were just too dumb to know how to do that at the time. But we were in this space of overthinking. We were overthinking our business. We were trying to be smart in how we were going to grow it. We were trying to optimize in order to get things to be just right. And Adi said something to me that really stuck. And he said, David, you're just never going to meet an idiot who isn't having a good time. And that just really stuck with me. And because of that, I realized that even if the ideas that I have that are dumb are not successful, which happens a lot, right? Same thing with smart ideas. But at the very least, just the action, right, of putting your mind in that arena, right, of dumb, I'm just always going to have a good time. So I would at least like to part with everybody. Just give it a try. You're going to have fun. Let your dumb side kind of your freak flag on the dumb side fly, and see what comes out of it. And at the very least, you're going to have fun.
Well, that brings us nicely to the end of our discussion today here on the Global Discussion. I want to thank everybody who's watching or listening to this episode around the world. Make sure that you like, you follow, you subscribe, do everything I need you to do to help support this show. And obviously, go and check out david-carson.com, get onto the newsletter, and keep an eye out for that book coming this summer. But, David, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks so much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you, Simon. Had a great time.